Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the first in the webinar series, Talk Back Better. My name is Nick Ishmael Perkins, and I'm going to be hosting the webinar today. The Talk Back Better webinar series is brought to you by the International Science Council in partnership with the Falling Walls International Year of Science Initiative. And this is a series which is part of the Public Value of Science program here at the ISC. And the webinar series, just to explain a little bit of the context, came about in response to repeated calls by the member institutions of the International Science Council to address issues which are challenging their ability to effectively communicate research and to shape evidence-based policy or indeed decision-making. And this obviously has been given particular urgency by the COVID pandemic, but to be honest, is a conversation that we've been having within the ISC Secretariat over the last 5 years. And some of this has been driven, for instance, by a challenge around climate communication. Now, Talk Back Better as a title is derived from the oft-repeated call to build back better during the COVID pandemic, and is associated with the ambition to use this unprecedented crisis of COVID-19 to transform our society in some way. And for some, this meant making our societies more resilient, and for others more equal, and sometimes both. And what we wanted to do was to think actually, okay, what can we do around applying this to the context of science communication? And we recognize that, of course, talk back better implies that science communication is focused on talking, which is obviously not the case. And indeed, it makes it sound perhaps more confrontational than might be necessary. But we felt that it was still sufficiently alliterative that actually it would work for our purposes. But as you will see, there's quite a lot of nuance around what we might do with progressive science communication rather than simply talking back to people or at people. So in thinking through what we were trying to achieve with the webinars, we spoke to the panel of experts for the Public Value of Science program and have identified what we consider some key themes that are really important for organized research to address if we're going to build the capacity of scientists across disciplines to communicate in a more effective way in view of the current global context. And this relates not only obviously to the political economy, decentralized platforms and decentralized editorial processes, but also to what we are seeing in the discussion around linking with, for instance, cognitive behavioral science, linking with other social science areas of research, including things like behavioral economics and so on. So really we see this is a very rich area where we can actually try to consolidate something around what progressive science communication might look like right now. And so for today, the first theme that we've identified is related to audiences, and in particular, some of the common misconceptions about audiences. So let me explain how we're going to approach the webinar. We are first going to have a bit of a provocation, as it were, for about 10 minutes or so by a very well-regarded science communicator, Jenny Metcliff. I'll introduce her in a second. Then we have a flash talk where we get to see quite briefly how a bit of research has been applied to this particular issue and what it offers us as an example of progressive science communication in practice in relation to audiences. And then we have a panel discussion, which will involve a few other experts coming with particular disciplinary and life experience to offer to the conversation. And that panel discussion will include, obviously, some questions from the audience, we're hoping. So let me begin first by turning to Jenny Metcliff, who has been a science communicator for over 33 years. She describes herself as a bit of a dinosaur, although I have to say that even this morning we were talking about some areas of work which she was aware of, and indeed it reflects how tapped in she is to networks and current practice across the sector. And she has worked with multilateral agencies, academies, she's worked on national campaigns. Jenny, it is a privilege to have you here with us, and I'm going to invite you now to share probably 10 minutes of remarks on an overview really of research and practice in the area, and what you see is, you know, some of the key areas of misconceptions around audiences.
At the end of February earlier this year, 1.5 meters of rain fell within 3 days on the suburb and the city in which I live in, which is Brisbane, Australia. This shows the front of my house, which isn't far from the Brisbane River, with about 1 meter of water flowing through it. And this is my office where I work with my colleagues. And you can see this is actually after the water has dropped. It was up near the windowsill. The sort of devastation that has happened from the flooding from this disaster that the Meteorology Office called a rain bomb. Unprecedented weather patterns thought to be caused by climate change. Now, I bought this house 5 years ago, knowing that it had flooded in the Brisbane floods of 2011, but thinking that it couldn't possibly happen again, and that the council had done a lot of work on the stormwater drains, and therefore I was safe. It suited my purposes to buy it. This is despite 3 decades of communicating about climate change and climate risk. Many of you may know that Australia, like some other countries around the world, has had a culture of misinformation and disinformation about climate change. And this has led to policy inaction. It has led to people being directly opposed to the science of climate change and action on it. Just last Saturday, the country elected in green candidates and what we call teal candidates, who are mostly women, who were electing on the platform of green ambitions, in particular with relation to climate change. So things are changing, but this is a culture of misinformation. Now, this is one of the things that is driving the ISC, is this misinformation and disinformation that's around. And we've seen it more recently with COVID. But why do we care? We care because science has a public value. It can help us to tackle the global problems like climate change. It can help at an individual, at a policy, at an international level in the decisions that we make, and we need good quality information to do that. It can enrich our lives. And fundamentally, it's my belief that scientists have a responsibility to communicate. So I'm not actually focusing on that misinformation and disinformation in my talk. I'm talking about how scientists can make a difference, which is what, in my experience, most scientists want to do, by understanding better who we are talking with. Now, Nick mentioned in the introduction the word audience. But when I look up the dictionary of the word audience, it's very much about scientists talking to spectators, whether that be through live performances, science shows, or in fact by producing something that might be read on the web or in a newspaper or in some other sort of publication. To me, as a science communicator, researcher, and practitioner, this smacks very much of that one-way communication, which is often referred to in the literature as the deficit model of communication, where the public are perceived to need knowledge and information, and science is a way in which they can achieve that information. Now, there's nothing wrong with one-way communication, but the problem arises if we think that is all science communication is, but it is much more than just that one-way communication. My number one principle over 33 years of being a science communication practitioner is that if you want to be effective in science communication, you need to understand who you are communicating with. Today, I'm going to talk about 3 of the different types of publics that I believe are out there. There are many others, and it depends on the context, the culture, and what science is involved in. But the 3 that I want to focus on today are the contra, those that are opposed to science, the consulted, and these are ones that scientists have deliberatively gone out to ask what they think, and then those that are concerned about an issue, which may involve the need to also involve scientists who are concerned about that issue. So first of all, going to contra. In Australia, there was a science communication graduate from the Australian National University called Joanne Nova, who decided that she didn't believe the science of climate change and started this very influential international global blog, which is very politicized. It's very much denying the science of climate change, but also other things to do with pandemics and diseases. You can see by this first one. This is one of her favorite ones, which talks about how temperatures in Australia were high and people were saying it's because of climate change. She said, no, it's always been high. And it goes on in that sort of vein. As part of the research for my PhD a number of years ago, I looked at the comments to 3 of the blogs that she had written on this site to do with the effect of climate and on causing local hazards and so on. And what I found was that of the 120 odd people who made comments, most of them were made by only 4 or 5 people. And that whenever someone came into the conversation who disagreed with the stance of this group, then they were very quickly shut down and left, and were often ridiculed about that. And I think this is something to remember when dealing with contra groups, is that they have their own social identity. There is a confirmation bias about the tribes that they belong to. They often use the same social media. They're attracted to the people that have their beliefs that they have. As I mentioned, maybe dominated by a few commentators, and there's a chanting to the choir. They are not listening to other points of view. I should add that I also then studied a pro-climate science site, again, started in Australia by a science communicator, an excellent site, which has won national awards and international recognition, which gives the correct information or the latest information about climate science. I looked at the comments on this blog at the same time that the comments were happening on the Joe Nova blog. And interestingly, I found exactly the same thing. The comments were dominated by a few people, and whenever anyone came in to disagree with those comments, they were quickly closed down. So scientists are also chanting to the choir. However, in dealing with contra publics, there are some tips that you might like to think about. And these are based on my experience as a researcher and a practitioner. And the first one is to look at what their values and concerns are. Is there any common ground? Often we find that there is. For example, food safety. Those that are anti-GM food often are most concerned about the safety of their health and their children. Well, so are the scientists. What are the common ground? Is there a place where we can start together? I don't think it helps to get into arguments and debates which only polarize the situation further. It's about being respectful and polite. The third point there is about choosing the right time. A lot of climate science activists came out in Australia when we had disasters like the flooding, like the bushfires, climate disasters, and said, look, the science is saying this, we need to act. That isn't the right time. At that time, people are dealing with the horror of that disaster. They are connecting again with their neighbours and their community who are helping them through that disaster, and they're not focused on the science. That's not the right time to communicate. I think it's really important to use their language and speak in a language that resonates with them. And very importantly, remember that you're not going to win everyone all the time, and any change with this group in particular is going to take a long time. And we're only just beginning to see that in Australia, for example, in the farming sector with climate change. In terms of communicating messages, and these are yes and no points that I developed in terms of communicating about climate change science. And you can see that the messages that resonate with people, and not just those that are contra, but those that don't really understand the science of climate change, is about solutions, not problems. It's about recognizing that people have emotions and values, and it's not just the facts that help them make decisions. Climate change is a global problem, but it's local impacts that resonate with people. And that's why we've seen such a groundswell of change of attitude in Australia, because of the local impacts. There are many solutions. It's not just one. It's not all about the science. It's about the people who it impacts. The costs of inaction have been shown to resonate much more than the costs of action. And rather than arguing the science, showing the trends is important, as well as showing that people can benefit from change rather than suffer from the impacts. Moving on, there's been about 20 years ago, a bit more than 20 years ago, there was a call that particularly came from the UK, but other countries, to move from one-way communication to having more of a dialogue or a communication between publics, various publics in sciences. And what that says was that your knowledge is important. We want to know what your concerns are. However, hidden below that often was still that need for people to support the science that we were doing. Now, this sort of consultation, the consulted publics, often happened when an issue was contentious and has been ongoing and has done some great things in the last 20, 25 years. An example of a program that I was involved in involved about 45 farmers from around Australia, from beekeepers to extensive beef cattle producers, in a program called the Climate Champion Program, which focused on climate risk. And over 6 years, they interacted with scientists. And the purpose of the program was to have these ambassadors who could communicate to their peers in the farming community. But a second purpose was for scientists to understand better who they were communicating with. And the program fundamentally transformed the scientists. They understood much better what the farmers' needs were from their research, from the climate risk tools that they were developing. It helped the researchers to shape their research products, the things that were coming out of their research to help farmers. Interestingly, it even changed the research that they were doing. And it fundamentally changed the way they communicated with farmers and their communities. So scientists can be transformed by that whole dialogue process if it's done correctly. I think in thinking about this, it's important to consider that consulting people is not a backdoor to getting support for your science. But on the other hand, and this relates to the contra publics as well, if people feel they have been heard, they are much more open to changing their views and their behaviours. People who are consulted really value being listened to rather than being told. They like to know that their knowledge is being heard and valued. They also like to know that scientists acknowledge that there's uncertainties in the science and what that means for interpreting that science. And fundamentally, it's about developing relationships. But when you've consulted people, tell them what difference it made. They like to know the difference that their input has made. Moving to the third group, the concern group. And this is a movement to more participatory science communication. And I've been involved with the agricultural research centres, writing up some of their stories, interviewing some of their researchers. And I was writing a country brief on sheep and goat farmers, the smallholder farmers in Ethiopia. And the scientists, the social scientists, the biophysical scientists in there, they explained to me that they actually brought this participatory science communication into their research. So what they did was to facilitate community conversations between farmers, between the people that supplied them with feed, between them and the people that marketed their products, the consumers that ate their products, and between those that could support them, like local vets and so on. And these conversations changed the communities and what they were doing. And here's a quote from one of the social researchers involved in the processes, who said, "It's in community conversations, we're not there to train, we're not there to transmit messages. It's about their knowledge. It's about facilitating them learning from each other." And these sort of conversations have created fundamental change. One example they gave was that one of the issues is gender equity. Women goat and sheep farmers are also doing domestic duties as well as looking after the goats and sheep. And this is putting enormous pressure on them. And when they explained this, the men listened in these facilitated conversations and realized how much pressure their wives, their daughters were under, and started to change their behavior and help with domestic chores. So it can create real change at that village, individual, family level that together can create changes in a nation and across the globe. It has a real power in that sort of process. And this is what I said was a participatory type of communication. Scientists are one player in this. In the example of Ethiopia, they were the facilitators, the trainers, the providers of technical expertise. But it was the farmers, it was the seed merchants, it was the marketers who shared their knowledge as well to create solutions so that sheep and goat farmers could have a more equitable and more productive existence. A colleague of mine, Tos Gascoigne, facilitated a book in 2020 that told the history of 39 different countries with regards to science communication. One of the chapters from the United Kingdom, authored by my colleagues Melanie Smallman, Simon Locke and Simon Miller, has this wonderful quote in it about the changing role of science communication. And they were referring to the concept of responsible research and innovation, saying that it had arguably shifted the role of science communicator from one who explains science to the public to one who helps scientists and technology developers understand society. Vitally important. In conclusion, and bringing it all together, I have 5 tips for those wanting to communicate as scientists or as science communication. I come back to that fundamental principle: understand who you're communicating with. What are their perceptions? What are their misperceptions about the topic of science under concern? What concerns do they have? What values are they bringing to the table? What are their communication needs? How do they like to be communicated with? How do they like to interact with each other and with scientists? What sort of information do they want? It's about valuing other forms of information. In the examples I've given today, it's about farmers' information. It's about seed merchants' information. It's also fundamentally about developing the relationships of trust. Using a mix of activities. I think there's a place for one-way communication, two-way communication, and that participatory one. And finally, it's about listening, and keeping on listening to be effective in communication.
Thank you, Jenny. I think that was fabulous. And I think you've illustrated really, I think, very eloquently this nice mix of discursive analysis, briefing from a history of research and a body of knowledge, and providing some quite pragmatic, practical tips. I should say that Jenny is also the president of the Public Communication of Science and Technology Network, PCST, which is a really interesting network that brings together practitioners and researchers in the field of science communication. I've tried here to summarize some of the key misconceptions that you identified during your presentation. And the first is actually audiences are as homogeneous blocks. And you started with a really helpful example of segmentation of an audience. The idea of audience as spectators. And I think you used lots of examples again around kind of how audiences or communities rather are capable of shaping research agendas, practice, and indeed the outcomes. Audiences being concerned with facts, but actually you've demonstrated again how facts actually are no more important, indeed some may argue even less important, than negotiating with people's values and their lived experience. And I'm sure we're going to hear a lot more about that with from some of our panelists based on their own particular interests and research. And also the importance of recognizing that audiences are not passive, but we need to acknowledge their agency. You know, that they have different options that they themselves might be negotiating. And also an audience or audiences as facilitators of learning, I think, which is great. I just want to say, actually, for those of you in the audience, thank you for your lovely chat messages and warm welcomes. And do put your questions in, because we will come back to Jenny. She will be joining us as part of the panel in a few minutes. But before we get to the panel, I want to invite Gary Montemere, who is Assistant Professor in the Department of Science Communication at the University of the Philippines. He's going to do a 5-minute flash talk about research that he's done linking development communication and science communication. Very excited to hear actually from Gary. Welcome, Gary.
Hi, good afternoon to all of you. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Development communication, or simply DevCom, is generally known as a distinct communication subdiscipline that aims to transform the lives of the poor and the disadvantaged into a better state through the systematic use of various methods and approaches. Now, when psychom praxis is infused with DevCom principles, psychom work tends to be purposive, value-laden, and pragmatic. Psychom work becomes much more complex then, because its aim is not just for the plain sake of improving science literacy or creating a more favorable public image of science, but first and foremost for helping people alleviate poverty. When directly working with people in the communities, we could easily see that there is never a one-size-fits-all approach to addressing wicked problems like this. So treating our audience collectively as one lump will not work, because individuals with whom we communicate science have different experiences and realities, and these affect what they believe, how they behave, and how they process and make sense of scientific information. If our psychom work aims to achieve concrete and observable outcomes, then we have to invest considerable time and resources in understanding our audiences. And we are doing this so that we know how to properly approach them and achieve the outcomes that we want. For us to look at our audiences as distinct publics instead of masses, we need to strategically classify them based on certain categories that would somewhat make them homogeneous, so that we could apply a common approach to them. And this is what audience segmentation is all about. Now, there are 4 basic approaches to segmenting audience. We could segment our audience based on geographic locations and demographics. And this is a more common in practice, simply because they are the easiest to do and explain. We could also segment audiences through what we call psychographics, and also based on behavior. So Jenny was talking about the 3 audiences earlier: the contra, the consulted, and concerned. These are examples of psychographic and behavioral ways of segmenting audiences. Audience segmentation is usually applied when designing targeted messages, but it could also be used when deciding whom to evaluate when assessing the impacts of certain interventions. I was invited to do a nationwide impact assessment of 3 publications being produced by a research and development institution that focuses on agriculture, aquatic, and natural resources innovations, I think sometime in 2016. Now, each publication has an intended audience, but the materials are shared with as many people as possible, even outside the target audience. This is so because the agency is interested both in achieving the outcomes and reaching as many audiences as possible. Now, this creates a challenge for evaluators because to determine if the publications have really created an impact, we need to classify the audiences into homogeneous, practically researchable, and mutually exclusive segments. And we could have sloppily lumped them as one generic public and planned our research methodology based on that assumption. But we should not, simply because these publications have different objectives and intended outcomes, and they target different audiences. And so they design the content of these publications based on the perceived needs of the primary audiences. If the audience is not clearly segmented, then we could not be able to look for unique individual impacts and surface subtle differences in the publication's effects on the readers. So what we did was to divide the audiences into two general types: those to whom they directly mail the printed publications, and those who have indirectly accessed any of the publications being evaluated. Now, this categorization is important because we'll use the first segmentation, the green one in your screen, to look for outcomes. And we will use the latter, the blue one in your screen, to basically determine the publication's reach. But this segmentation is not enough because the results that we will obtain solely from this broad categorization might be inadequate for our purpose. To produce the results that make sense to impact assessment, then we need to look at the differences within these categories. So we further segmented our audience respondents based on their roles as users of the publications. So for publication number 1, we surveyed professional agricultural technicians, we surveyed researchers from different government agencies, and researchers, faculty members, and students in different state colleges and universities. For publication 2, we surveyed media personnel and broadcasters. And for publication 3, we primarily targeted farmers, but we further segmented them into farmer scientists, farmer entrepreneurs, and small-scale farmers. Now, we did this to make sure that the segment is relevant, meaning we can further capture the fine nuances of the perceived effects, which we need to show in our study. We also surveyed other audiences as seen on your screens. And then we organized 3 focus group discussions to look at the qualitative impacts of each of the publications being evaluated. Now, to surface unique impacts, this time we segmented the participants first based on geographic location and then based on the type of publication they're exposed to. We also ensured that the different representatives from the original audience segmentation were invited to participate in the FGD. Now, because of this careful segmentation of respondents and audiences, we were able to surface diverse and unique results across segments, which we would not be able to do had we treated the audience as one generic public. So in the end, we were able to come up with a detailed set of recommendations to further improve the agency's publications. So in summary, if we want to achieve specific outcomes in our SciComm work, then we have to put an effort to understand our audiences. And we're doing this so that we could better engage with them when communicating science, communicating in and for science, and evaluate our SciComm initiatives. So I think that's all. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy to join you in this webinar.
Thank you, Gary. That's a really compelling. I have a case study of the value of segmentation of audiences, and I have lots of questions for you about it because I can imagine all kinds of areas around applications. But I think what's really important is that you have been able to demonstrate the strategic and pragmatic value of very careful and thoughtful segmentation of your audience for impact. Okay, now I want to sort of have a little bit of a panel discussion. I'm going to start by asking Dan and Felix to join the conversation. I'm very quickly going to ask them to share their reflections on what they've heard so far. And I can see that there are some questions that have come in from the audience. I'll turn to them momentarily. Let me start with introductions. Dr. Dan Williams is an early career research fellow at Corpus Christi College at the University of Cambridge. His work draws on evolutionary, cognitive, and social sciences to address philosophical and psychological questions concerning nature and causes of belief, ignorance, and irrationality. Always a pleasure to speak to you, Dan. As you know, I find your work endlessly fascinating. And Dr. Felix Bass is an award-winning Indian science communicator and a public educator who is currently a professor at Central University of Punjab in India. He is big on YouTube and also, intriguingly, has discovered seven new plant species in India and Antarctica. Welcome, Felix. I'll start with you, Dan. Any reflections from Jenny's provocations or from Gary's flash talk?
I loved both of them and I'm in complete agreement with them. I'll just sort of mention three things that struck me. One was this recurring theme of the idea that the public is not this homogeneous blob, but is highly differentiated, different background views, assumptions, identities, values, and so on. And that if you're not sensitive to that differentiated character of the public, you're not going to get very far in science communication. I also thought what Jenny was saying about this sort of contra public, that aspect of the public who, at least when it comes to certain topics, is sort of actively hostile to scientific knowledge or scientific consensus, is such a crucial point, and it's such a crucial point of distinction between different kinds of audiences. And especially the topic of climate change, because I think what's been absolutely disastrous when it comes to climate change over the past several decades has been this politicization of the topic, where many people, especially from more sort of conservative, right-wing political identities, have, for various reasons, some deliberate, some just unfortunate, come to view climate science as this really politicized thing, and have viewed being a sort of climate denialist as a badge of political identity. And that has been absolutely disastrous, I think. And it's also something you really have to be aware of when it comes to communicating the science of climate change, because to the extent that people view their resistance to that science as part of their political identity, they're not going to be sort of dispassionately pursuing the truth on that topic. And you have to be absolutely responsive to that. And then thirdly, just to echo something that Jenny said, which was about the importance of being respectful and polite. Science communication is a form of communication, and all communication depends on trust. So if people don't trust you, they're not going to listen to anything you're going to say. And one good reason people would have for not trusting you is if they think that you are in some sense talking down to them or looking down upon them. So it's absolutely crucial when it comes to science communication that people view you as talking to people you regard as equals and that you're respectful of. So that was really just to boringly repeat the three things that featured in the talks, but that I definitely agree with.
I wanted to kind of follow up on, I know, and everything you're saying makes a lot of sense, really interesting. And I was really intrigued by what, Jenny said around kind of like, there is, I think, in science communication, a preoccupation with the facts. And, and Jenny, I think, again, said very clearly and very articulately, it's not just about the facts. You have to be thinking about values. And I know that in the past, you have talked about the fact that people have social identities that matter to them enormously, possibly more than anything else. And do you want to say something around this and how social identity relates to facts and values?
Yeah, I mean, human beings are profoundly groupish animals. So we develop strong emotional attachments to investments in sort of abstract group identities of various different kinds. So religious communities, nations, cultural groups, subcultural groups. And if people ever view science as, in some sense, a threat to or at odds with an identity-defining group from which they derive meaning and belonging, that's going to be a very powerful reason for rejecting science and for rejecting the claims to knowledge which science makes in that subject. So I think in general, this comes back to the issue of being highly sensitive to who you're communicating to when it comes to science communication. But in general, it's absolutely crucial for the science of science communication to acknowledge that if you want people to be trusting of science, they can never view it as being in tension with communities, identity-defining groups from which they derive meaning and belonging.
Yes, okay, that's very clear. Felix, any reflections on what you've heard?
Yeah, both the talks were fantastic, and I really enjoyed both of the presentations, especially the Jenny and Gary's talk on the participatory communication. And the one overarching theme which I found is that there is no one size fits for all in any forms of communication. We need to understand the audience. Indeed, audience itself is, it's a constructed. Of course, there is no audience, only communities to exist. That is what I could get it from the Jenny's talk. Fantastic. And yeah, the God Farmer, the participatory communication and how it is actually impacting on the community. That's a great message that you relied on. I really like that one. And Gary's talk on developmental communication is also quite an eye-opener, and designing the flyers and books targeting specific audience in Philippines is, I think it's a very good practical approach for implementing this, this particular personalized communication, in the real life. And a completely different field is the medicine. For example, there is a huge development in the field of medicine. There's something called personalized medicine. Instead of like one pill for all, just like generic medicine. So we do a genome sequencing, and based on the differences in the genome, then the medicines, get prescribed, right? And the quality and quantity wise as well. So exactly same thing is going to transform the world of communication now. It's like personalized communication, which is pretty interesting. And another quick thought coming from my side, because I'm a teacher, is from the field of pedagogy. So there is a development not it's not like modern, the so-called flipped class method, in which we relay the content prior to the class. So the class we turn into two-way communication. It's completely discussion. So we record the lectures and we give it to students, and they come to the class prepared. And that completely fosters, the two-way communication in the classroom. So all these fields are quite interesting, and yes, I really enjoyed. So
thanks, Felix. And in fact, you have linked very naturally to one of the questions that we have in the Q&A. Thank you for the questions that are coming in. There are a few in there. I also just want to draw to your attention that in the chat, my colleagues here at the ISC have been putting links to various resources as they are referred during our discussion. So Felix, you were talking about personalization and actually the idea of personalized medicine and how might this apply in the context of communication, which I think is an intriguing idea. But a member of our audience has said, could the panelists comment more on what makes stories credible, ethical, and authentic while not riding the personalization horse too far? Now, and I guess the question is, surely there must be a limit to how far we can go with this personalization, recognizing the obvious benefits of it. Are there ways that we can not go too far in terms of personalization, but still maintain a certain amount of credibility with the kind of communication that we're doing? Does anybody want to have a go at responding to that? Okay, Jenny.
Well, I think storytelling is about people, so it's going to be personalization. But I think the trick with telling science stories is that it's not just a story about scientists. It's a story about the people their science affects, involves, and the relationships that have developed. And that's where you can get that authenticity there, that it's not just a story that is there about science or to promote science. It's a story about how science is working to create difference in people's lives in some way, even if it's only to add more basic knowledge about something that's important or interesting or fascinating.
Any other comments on that? This question of personalization?
I can say a few words about the education sector. There is a lot of interesting development in the field of education, personalized education by AI. AI is again transforming. It's like the MOOC, but the content on your dashboard depends on your your understanding of the subject. So that's very interesting way, and I don't think that you will ever go wrong in personalization of the communication. It's always a good thing, but again, it depends on how much how much resources you have. And yeah, so for example, super rich people in Britain, like the royal family, can have private tutors, and nowadays it is not practical, but AI is transforming that field. We can have personalized content on your the dashboard. So yeah, so communication going personalized, I don't think there is any any cons of it, but again, that depends on the resources availability.
I mean, I think this is a fascinating, slightly concerning idea that, if we talk about AI, immediately my head goes to algorithms. And we know that algorithms can be quite dangerous. But you seem to have a very benign vision of how that could work, Felix. So you're quite confident that AI would work and that we wouldn't have to worry that AI would end up reproducing some of the problematic dominant models.
Yes, I of course, the AI, I don't say that AI is always good. It all depends. So yes, AI, the dystopic vision that AI is always dangerous, I don't subscribe to it. But of course, the AI for the education sector is pretty good. At least that the kind of like, for example, language learning, so there are several apps available which do incorporate the, AI in it. For example, Duolingo, very popular. Yes. And of course, the Duolingo's learning curve depends on how you are performing. It's like gamification, but yes, it's learning. Okay. There is a fuzzy logic going on. So yes, so I'm really optimistic about the AI in communication sector.
Okay, great. Jenny, another question for you. Somebody who has been obviously thinking quite deeply about your segmentation efforts, and they would like to know your thoughts on and ways to engage perhaps a fourth kind of public, that is audiences that are indifferent or disinterested in science.
Yes, well, and that I think is the potential of science communication, and it really depends on your objective. I mean, there's always going to be people who will never care less about science, but that there might be something in their life that touches, that's interested, that's relevant to them, and it's all about relevance. What is relevant to their lives? How can science help them make better decisions? I think during COVID, more than any other time in the history since I've been alive, people have been interested in science. They're no longer as disinterested as they were before, because they want to know, what is this pandemic? What is this virus? What is the vaccine? Is it safe? What are the medications? Are they safe? And so they're searching for credible information. So in many ways, issues like this create what is called an issue-created public. So issues can create a public that was previously indifferent or disinterested. And there's no reason why an issue shouldn't create a public. If you're just trying to get people fascinated and interested in science, that's a somewhat harder gig, I think. And that's often about entertainment and spectator science than it is about science that will really make a huge difference to people's lives. It's also valid in its own right, but it is a different sort of science.
I want to follow up on that because I think we have to also, just as we segment audience, we have to do the same thing, I think, with science. Because I know that there was a bit of research that was done recently in Australia, and I know, Jenny, you and I, we've talked about this, where they identified that the people who were most dismissive about climate science were also some of the people who were most enthusiastic about the COVID vaccine. And vice versa. So you had people who were big champions of the COVID vaccine, but were also still actually, quite dismissive of the COVID vaccine, but were actually big advocates for around climate change. And so people actually engage not with science as one big homogenous block, but again, going back to the point that you've raised, which is actually dependent on how it has touched their lives. And I think we have to be really quite careful in thinking about this. Actually, when we talk about, oh, this people, this person doesn't like science and this person does like science, because actually it can really depend a bit on the issue and, again, how the public is created around an issue, as you were explaining it, I think. There's
a US psychology researcher who's written a lot about risk communication, Sandman. And in speaking particularly about climate change denial, but I think it relates to other sorts of contra science. He says that people tend to reject the science for three reasons. The first is because it's strategic. If they accept the science, they're going to have to change their jobs. They're going to have to do things differently. They'll have to get rid of their big cars. They'll have to think a bit more carefully about waste, etc. So it's strategic for them to deny it. The second type are the intellectual deniers, people who have done what they consider to be their own research, which they think proves it to be wrong. That's the smallest group. But by far the largest group, and the group that I think science communicators perhaps should be focusing on, is those who deny it from a psychological point of view. They just can't deal with it. And this is often the case with a global problem that they feel at a local and an individual or even at a community level that they just can't deal with. And that's where I think there's real opportunities for science communication.
Yeah, this is really interesting. I want to turn to Dan in response to that, although just before that, and Dan, there's also a question here I want to pose to you, which I think is a question that's on everybody's mind when they think about the challenge of science communication. But before I do that, I just want to go back to Jenny and suggest, you see that second group, the ones who've done their own research, is the smallest group. And you're probably right, huh? Although again, I wonder actually how much research has really been done around these kind of groups. And maybe you're aware of research that's been done, but it feels like that second group that you talk to is the largest group, because that's where you come across the most anecdotes of people who are like, oh no, actually I know this, or I've thought it through, or I've done. And usually, and I know this because of friends, I have an uncle like this, and we were recently talking about treatments for COVID, and he had a particular idea, which was unconventional, shall we say, but it involves sunlight. And I said, and where are you getting this? He said, oh, it's like all over YouTube. And I said, yeah, YouTube, really? He's like, yeah, no, I looked into it. And I think, but have you looked at the Lancet? And of course, for him, it's like, whatever. So it feels sometimes that actually that second group can be the ones that are, that you come across the most and the most, because I suppose they're the ones that feel most emboldened, because actually there's a confidence around having that made some effort and coming to a conclusion. Dan, it'd be interesting to hear your reflections on what Jenny was just saying, but there's also a question here, which, as I say, I think is really central to the challenge that we focus. And the question is, how can we start to dissociate political identity or group identity and climate change denial, right? Is there any hope that this can actually be done through trust building and relationship building?
That's a great question. And I would say it's extremely tough. I mean, once these sorts of things become politicized, that's a really difficult challenge then to address. I mean, you should have hope that it can be done. I mean, there's nothing intrinsic, for example, about any particular political identity, which means that you have to reject the science on a particular topic. So it's always contingent, but nevertheless, once it becomes entrenched, it then becomes a serious problem to deal with. I mean, in the US, there's been some success associated with the work of people like Dan Kahan in terms of decoupling specification of the problem from available solutions. So you want to say, look, here are the facts of the matter. Let's set aside what the political response is going to be to those facts, so that you somewhat drive a wedge in between the political values and identities and the recognition of the problem. There's also a sort of program which I think should have more attention, which is encouraging influential, prestigious in-group members to come out and dissent from the group consensus, and showering such individuals with praise when they do, because that's really important. And then also one thing that touches on what Jenny mentioned in her presentation, which is trying to render, for example, the political identity aspects less salient and making more salient the things that anyone cares about, no matter what their political identity is, which is things like their family, their children, their grandchildren, and so on. So reframing things in that way can often make people much more receptive to the science and topic like that. But I would say it's a massive topic whenever these things get politicized. So really what you want to do is to have a sort of general approach when it comes to public understanding of science, of making sure that these topics don't get politicized to begin with, to sort of decouple the facts of the matter and the claims to knowledge within science from these other political debates, because it can be a disaster when those two things get entangled.
I mean, but is it inevitable that they become entangled?
I don't think it's, it depends, but I would say it's not inevitable. Stepping back, it's totally understandable and in some sense desirable that, for example, people on the left and people on the right would have different values, different overarching ideologies, but it's not inevitable that they should disagree on basic matters of fact. Even though there are many kinds of psychological and social reasons why that ends up happening, and you find that kind of polarization. So it's not inevitable, but there are some things that push in that direction. And I think once that has happened, it then becomes really difficult as a problem to address. Okay.
I mean, and then very specifically on this issue here about trust building and relationship building, right? Because you've said it's helpful to find people within, in the in-group to basically start to challenge or adapt the narrative and to reward them when this happens. But of course, part of the problem is that if they're influential, the idea is they have most to risk, most to lose by risking their status in the in-group by challenging the narrative, which in fact, and we see this, I think, a lot, we haven't talked about this yet, but we see this a lot, I think, with things like policymakers and politicians who are themselves embedded in a system of patronage, and somehow we go directly to them to influence without seeming somehow to acknowledge they're part of a constituency, their identity is linked with that constituency. Yeah, I see you're nodding your head.
It's a really, you've identified, a really serious problem. And in a way, it gets back to this issue of once it's happened that these topics become politicized in that way, it is then really, really difficult to see what to do about it. So I think being more proactive about that and doing your best as societies to stop that from happening is a sort of meta solution to many of these problems, but that itself is really difficult.
Yeah, I mean, because of course I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you if you can give an example of how you might avoid something becoming politicized. Because, for instance, what you described about kind of like stating the facts and kind of separating that from the politicization of solutions. Can you give us an idea? I'm thinking if I am a researcher sitting here thinking, okay, that's interesting conceptually, how do I, make that happen? What does that look like?
Again, I think it's tough. I think in terms of the way in which the science is described, to the best of one's ability to go about communicating that science such that it's not obviously threatening to values or identities that people hold dear. But I'm, work in philosophy and theoretical psychology, so I don't feel particularly equipped when it comes to these on the ground issues of science communication. So I would defer to the others when it comes to these issues of practical advice.
I mean, it is interesting because there is a question here that kind of follows up on that. How do the panel have any thoughts on how issues like climate change become badges of identity for segments of the public in the first place? And I guess this is coming back to that, how do you avoid the politicization? Do we understand when that starts to coalesce? Does anybody want to offer any thoughts on this? Gary, I know you've been a bit quiet. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, well, I think that science is always political. It has always been political, and I really don't know the answer for that question, really. But what I want to share with you is that you can, like what Dan is saying earlier, the key to really understanding your audiences is to listen to them. So even though you are not familiar, or you tend to not understand what they're saying, or not agree to what they're saying, as science communicators, we really need to listen to them intently. And by listening, I'm not saying just shutting up while they are talking. No, you have to have this personal interest to really understand and learn from other people, so that you know where they're coming from. And once you know where they're coming from, it might transform you in a way, but it could also influence how you could direct the conversation regarding climate change.
Okay. I guess actually, if you take that to its logical conclusion, it is perhaps a way to, if not avoid the politicization, at least avoid the contestation, which becomes politicized. So, you can have different political orientations around the solution, but at least it doesn't become actually about the very contestation of the facts. And a zero-sum game, as it were, I would imagine, because in fact, you're invested in both narratives in some way. I imagine. Jenny, Felix, have you unmuted yourself because you're about to respond?
Oh, well, I don't really have an answer to that question. Again, I'm not from that field, but just to brainstorm on a related aspect, there has been a battery of papers, psychology papers came up in recent months set against the pandemic, about the preferences with the political lineage, with a propensity to believe in fake news and conspiracy theories. And overwhelming majority, I would say almost every single paper says that if you're conservative, chances of having a cognitive bias called jumping to conclusion bias is extremely high. Again, it's a correlation, doesn't mean causation. Keep that in mind. But yes, there are several interesting papers have come up, and then that doesn't mean that labeling conservative as a fake news spreader or propagandist is a good idea rather. But if you belong to that category, then it's better to be be aware of this climate denialism, or self-introspection is extremely important for the people. I mean, these, the papers are really eye-opener, I would say. And one of the very interesting paper which I read recently is about cognitive immunization, which is preemptively exposing yourself to the pseudoscience and fake news. It's like immunization, so it's get exposed to yourself and detect the patterns to recognize the pseudoscience, and that's that way I think it works. So the question about the trust in sensu stricto, I don't think that the trust really matters in science. It doesn't matter, do I believe in climate change or not? The climate change is real because the science deals with objective reality, but still there has been several reactionary developments. For example, March for Science. So yes, so trust matters in those those topics which are directly related to the pandemic. For example, the epidemiology, or or the emergency situations. So in which we really have to follow the guidelines.
Okay, so that's just interesting, because you're suggesting that actually, maybe some of this obsession with trust in a way is playing into what Dan was referring to, right? Which is actually playing into a certain kind of politicization, and that actually we should say, in fact, science is above the issue of trust. It's just the way it is. I guess, Jenny, I can see you're bursting to say something.
I think the sort of trust that you're probably all discussing at the moment, although I'm not totally sure, is what's referred to as institutional trust in institutions, rather than necessarily interpersonal trust. And the participatory science communication programs that I've been involved in, particularly the Climate Champion program of farmers that ran over 6 years, was very much about creating interpersonal trust between scientists and farmers, which was enormously powerful. One of the findings of the research I did into that project was that through developing those relationships of trust, both scientists and farmers felt much more open to saying things they normally wouldn't say. from a scientist's point of view, they were really open about what they didn't know and any weaknesses in the science, which they normally wouldn't be like. They were open about blockages to action from their own institutions with the farmers, because they knew these farmers, they were in many cases, they became really good friends. So it was a really interpersonal situation of trust that really moved the behaviours of the farmers and the scientists in a really positive way. But one of the questions in the chat is, this sort of personalised communication takes a lot of time and money. How do you do that? And the Climate Champion program was very expensive. But I think at the start of the program, there were farmers in there who were leading farmers who didn't necessarily believe the science of climate change. By the end of that whole association, they and the farming community are now much more aligned with the science of climate change. And some of those farmers involved in the program are now part of what's called Farmers for Climate Action, which has caused policymakers and funders of research some little cause for concern. Maybe one of the reasons why the program was cut down. But it does require a significant investment to have these really concentrated relationship building programs between science and publics over a period of years, because it takes time for that to happen.
Yeah, and I think,
but it can be so powerful.
Yeah, and I think one of the things I was going to say is that actually we have to be careful not to confuse expense with cost effectiveness. And I am reminded of a definition I once heard of transdisciplinary working, which is actually where you build sufficient trust that every knowledge system can be interrogated. Now, we have just over 5 minutes left, and I want to invite the panelists to share what they would say is probably the most important thing for anybody who's on the webinar to think about actually when they're in the office on Monday morning, actually in terms of audiences and science communication. What's the most important thing for them to take into the office, as they apply their work? A question has just slipped in, a wee question that says, is religion anti-science? And what I would do is I would turn this around and say, actually, is religious belief a problem in the way that we conceive audiences, for science communication? And I'll probably actually put that question to you, Dan, and also ask you, what's the one thing, you can also sort of reflect on the one thing that you would suggest researchers or research managers should be thinking about come Monday morning on this issue.
Just on the small question of religion, yeah, I obviously it's very difficult to generalize about these things, but I would say for the most part, no, religion is not anti-science, and people's religious beliefs can coexist with deference to scientific knowledge on certain topics. In fact, I think it's a somewhat non-scientific view of religion to think of it as being in tension with science, because I think religion, for the most part, is to do with identity and community and belonging and meaning and that sort of thing. In terms of practical advice, as I've mentioned, I come from philosophy and theoretical psychology, and I would defer to others when it comes to practical advice. I suppose just at the most general level, I do think when it comes to the science of science communication, there has been, even though there's a recognition that the deficit model has certain problems, I think there has been too much deference to that general picture, and there should be more attention to trust, both institutional and interpersonal, respect, identity, these sort of somewhat less tangible things, but that I think are absolutely crucial when it comes to conversation and communication and so on.
Thank you, Dan. And Felix, what do you think is one thing that people should really be aware of thinking, as they continue their work on this issue?
Okay, so the one which is coming right now to my mind is about the illusion of the explanatory depth, as well as the various other cognitive biases. So there is one interesting statement by Einstein that if you cannot explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough Yes, so that is the Feynman also, the Richard Feynman also put up. So I think the most important take home message for the science communication is to explain in a very simple way that even the students, the elementary school students should know it. So in any of my science writings, so I employ the quality control agents as elementary school students. So if you cannot explain that simple to a student, then that means that it doesn't really work, and people don't really have an attention span to listen to your jargon-filled communication, right? So I think you should make it as simple as possible. And I really love Reddit a lot. So there is a subreddit called ELI5, explain like I'm 5. So any complex philosophical concept, you can just check it out there, ELI5. So in very simple way, how do you explain as if a 5th-year-old can understand your concept well? So yes, that's my tip.
I have to say, actually, what it does, I think, Jenny, this is a really interesting example of what you've talked about, where, in fact, a very particular audience, a very particular mode of communication is influencing the way that science is understood. Because actually it's kind of forcing science to rethink how do we describe, conceive, articulate our knowledge in this context. I see that actually there's a follow-up question here about religious nations, but I think actually I think Dan's point still pertains, which is that actually we need to really think quite carefully about how we understand religion, because I mean, religious nations, I can think immediately of a few examples of nations which are of states. Presumably here we're talking about states as opposed to nations and ethnic groups, but states which are certainly not secular, but where science and technology is apparently high on the government policy agenda. So I think we need to really interrogate this and be careful of broad meta-narratives in that regard. Jenny, because I know that you, again, your presentation, you provided some, I think, quite useful ideas. What's one that you would prioritize?
Well, I said in my presentation, the most important principle was to understand who you're talking with. But the most important communication skill, and Felix alluded to this, is listening. And most of us aren't good listeners. So consider, are you a good listener? And by that, I mean, do you actively listen? And I use an acronym called LACE, which is listen, acknowledge what you hear, clarify anything you don't understand, and then elicit more information.
Very helpful. And Gary, do you have any, in 30 seconds, is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, first, before you do any science communication activity, you should know why are you doing it. You have to have your concrete set of objectives on why you are doing science communication. Do you want to gain public trust from the people? You want to explain science concepts? You want them to understand something? So you have to set that up at the very beginning of any science communication activity. And then you need to understand your audience, like what we're discussing this evening. You can do that by starting doing needs assessment or assessing the needs of your audiences. And sometimes doing these kinds of things are not prioritized. Sometimes in project proposals, for example, you do not put some resources for needs assessment. But needs assessment is very important if you are doing science communication, especially when you want to have some outcomes later on. So those are the two things. Now you have to be clear on what you're doing and why you're doing it. You have to have your objectives. And second, you really need to know your audience. You really need to know their needs.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for taking the time to join us today. For those of you who are online, we're going to share the page to register for future webinars. These will be running throughout the month of June, and we'll have the next one at the same time next Thursday. And this webinar will focus on digital communities and social media. Thank you all, and thanks to the team here at the ISC who have been providing us with some technical support. Looking forward to chatting with some of you next week.